Hello and welcome as we continue this journey toward the third Sunday after Pentecost, June the 13th, 2021. And today we will be looking at the Gospel for Sunday, coming from St. Mark in the 4th chapter, verses 26 through 34. So first let me read for you the introduction to the Gospel, then the Gospel itself, and share with you some reflections that I've gathered for today. Jesus frequently uses parables to teach ordinary people as they are able to hear and understand. Images of sowing and growing show the vitality of God's kingdom. Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow, and he does not know how. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes with his sickle, because the harvest has come." He also said, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable will we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which, when sown upon the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet, when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the air can nest in its shade." With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Some of you may be gardeners, and so these parables about seeds and plants help you understand the kingdom of God a little bit better. I am not a gardener. I do not grow things, and please do not contact me with suggestions about how I can become a gardener. With all due respect to those who enjoy gardening, I do not. I do not want to become a gardener. No offense. I'm happy to leave that to the people who enjoy it. So for those of us who are not into agriculture, what helps us understand what is meant by kingdom, reign, rule, realm, or the empire of God? We do not live in a kingdom. We do not have monarchs. I seem to remember there was a Revolutionary War fought to get out from under what was perceived as a dictatorial ruler or king. Many Americans these days prioritize individual rights over community, and certainly over being told what to do. As Christians, we might feel comfortable with speaking about God as the king, and at the same time, we may not completely understand what that means or when it's supposed to happen. Maybe we're only comfortable with God being king once we get to heaven, and we would prefer that we get to make our own choices and do things our own way while we live here on the earth. The introduction to today's gospel reading reads, "Jesus frequently uses parables to teach ordinary people as they are able to hear and understand." Maybe that was more true for the people of Jesus' day than it is for the people of the 21st century USA. Or maybe these parables make more sense to farmers and gardeners than to others. Maybe it's just me. Although I would rather be like one of those disciples that Jesus took aside at the end of today's reading and explained to them everything that the parables meant, because I'd be scratching my head. As an example, the farmer in the first parable simply goes out and scatters the seed. Now, the image here, and this is what they did, is a person who walks along with a bag or something containing seed, grabs a handful and just scatters it. Just walks along throwing seed as they go. Then he goes to bed. And day by day, the farmer waits for the plants to grow. You know, even though I do not like gardening, my dad did. And so when I was just young, very young, my dad decided I needed to work in his garden. I may not have liked it, yet I can never remember walking along just throwing seeds about. I remember tilling the soil. I remember making straight-ish lines. In fact, my dad had string between sticks that he would run to make a straight line, so as straight as possible anyway. And we would furrow the line, and then we would use our fingers and a certain specific amount of space between. We would poke a hole, put in the seed and cover it up. Go a certain specific space, poke a hole, plant the seed and cover it up. And then we would have to visit the garden regularly, and that meant, while I was in school, that meant every Saturday. During the summer, it meant more often. I may not have understood much, although I did understand that the process required a lot of time, which usually started before the sun came up, and a lot of effort. And frankly, most of the vegetables that my dad grew in the garden, I did not want. If growing the kingdom of God is comparable to the work and the produce that came from my experience of working in my dad's garden, then I can begin to understand why some people are just not all that interested. What I do know about gardening is it's a lot of work, and I don't like it. I can appreciate the people who like gardening, especially the farmers. I'm very grateful to the farmers that grow the produce that I can find in the grocery store. Now, using that same logic, I can understand that there are people who appreciate the work that others do to grow God's kingdom and happily come to church on Sunday and then they go home. And maybe these are like the people from that first parable that would sleep and rise night and day, and God's kingdom would sprout and grow, and they do not know how. I don't mean that in a mean-spirited way, but a lot of people just come to church on Sunday and then they go home. Even so, the first parable and the second parable, they're at odds with each other, even though it may not be all that obvious to us non-gardeners. For those of you who are gardeners, are there any plants that may have some value, yet you do not want them in your garden because they take over everything and probably kill the other plants? Mustard is such a plant. And those listening to Jesus may be wondering, what's the point of putting these two parables together? Mustard is an herb with medicinal purposes and one that's useful for flavoring and even for preserving food. The mustard bush, though, that's a garden problem. No one listening to Jesus would sow it on purpose. It grows all too readily. You don't even have to try. And once it appears, it takes over. It has almost a predatory ability, and it crowds out the other crops that may have been planted on purpose. So planting grain and mustard, that would be a disaster for the one who wanted the grain. Yet, here Jesus is telling two parables, one right after the other, that say the kingdom of God is like each. It's rather confusing. Perhaps the point of both taken together is that the first parable, the farmer scatters the seed, yet he doesn't seem to understand how or why it grows. And in the second parable, the mustard plant is outside of our control. It spreads with or without us. Now, for those of us who like to be in control, who like to analyze things so we can keep everything orderly, everything in its place, those 2 points, they can be deflating. They're a stark reminder that God is God and we're not. That the kingdom of God belongs to God and not to us. And that we are expected to work for the kingdom while it's Jesus later who brings in the harvest. For people who want to do things their own way, for people who want to keep what they sow for themselves, understanding what it truly means to be a follower of Jesus becomes problematic. Making the world a better place sounds good, until some people realize that may require sacrificing their personal advancement over others. All of the readings for today, all of the readings, taken together, teach us about becoming a believer, that it's not about getting what we want for ourselves. It's about being empowered to serve God and to serve others. I cannot wrap today's gospel reading in this pretty bow and make it the feel-good message that some people want to hear each and every week. There is no easy take-home message for us in these parables. They ask us to engage our imaginations, to follow the possibilities and the inconsistencies that we distinguish between a world where everything needs to be planned and linear and logical, to one filled with mysteries and surprises, into which a sovereign God, the King, invites us. And at the same time, they teach us that the kingdom of God is not all about us. It's about God and about God's will. Yet the good news is that God's kingdom is full of vitality, and that God's will is a plan for salvation. That is what's best for us, regardless of what the world teaches us that we should want for ourselves. I know that's a lot to hold on to and ponder, yet I encourage you to consider these parables and what they say. And if you want to talk about it, give me a call. I hope you're having a great day. Take care. God bless.